respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders past and present, and those of the First Nations people on lands wherever we conduct the business of the university. Welcome everyone to this webinar, which will present the major findings of a 3.5-year project on the early delivery of equitable and healthy transport options in new suburbs. Quite a long title. It's been quite a long and involved project on a very important planning issue, which I'm sure you all understand, how to provide alternative options to private car travel to residents of new growth area suburbs in a timely way. I've been nominally leading this project, but most of the actual research has been conducted by the fabulous team of researchers from the Centre for Urban Research, who you will hear from today. And the project has been managed with great skill and tenacity in these difficult COVID times by Annette Kroen, who will lead us through most of the work this afternoon. In addition to acknowledging and thanking her and the rest of the team, I also want to take the opportunity, especially as we might run out of time at the end, to thank all those dedicated members of our project advisory group, representatives from the cities of Casey and Wyndham, from Stockland Australia, from the Victorian branch of the Planning Institute of Australia, the Department of Transport, the Victorian Planning Authority and Infrastructure Victoria. The participation of these people, and I won't name them all because in some cases the representatives have changed over the 3-year period, but several of whom will be speaking this afternoon, has really ensured that the project stayed on track and was as relevant and useful to practitioners as it could be. So I want to thank everybody, all those individuals, very sincerely for their time and effort. But of course, make it clear that while we deeply value their input, the results are the findings of the RMIT research team and not necessarily endorsed by those organisations. The project was funded by RMIT through its Urban Futures Enabling Capability platform and by contributions from a number of those partner organisations to whom, as I said, we are very grateful. The program of speakers for this afternoon, I don't know if we can put it up on the screen, but it will have contributions from the research team, Annette Kroen, as I mentioned, Lucy Gunn and Steve Pemberton, and also from some of the members of the project advisory group, Diana Rice from Wyndham, Carly Goodrich from Casey, Tim Westcott from PIA, Paul Cassidy from the VPA, and Kath Phelan from Infrastructure Victoria. And Kath, I think, deserves a special shout out as she was one of the instigators of this project when she was in her previous role at RMIT. While thanking people, and in case I don't get a chance at the end, I'd also like to mention Elizabeth Taylor, who I hope will be somewhere on the call, from Monash University, who also had a major hand in shaping the project in its early days when she was at RMIT. So finally, before I hand over to Annette, just a bit of housekeeping. We have quite a large audience today and a fairly full program. Once we get started, if I could ask you to turn your camera off unless you are speaking, and also to mute your microphone. And please note that we're recording today's proceedings so that others can watch it later. I hope at the end that we'll have 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So as we go along and as they occur to you, put your questions in the chat, and when the time comes, I'll either read them out if they're clear or I'll call on you to elaborate if it's not clear to me exactly what you're asking. So now, in the interest of time, I will hand over to Annette, who will begin by providing some background on the project.
Yep. Great, thank you, Robin. Good, I hope everyone can see the screen. I think they should. So yes, as Robin said, I'll be providing some background on the project to start us off. So I had listed actually the project advisory group and the team, although Robin has already mentioned everyone, so I won't go through the list again, but would actually, well, at least not of the advisory group, but I would like to thank the team members of whom some are here, but others aren't, like Melanie Devan, Christy Gruder couldn't make it today. So yes, but we had a big team working on this project. And yeah, I would also like to thank the team and the project advisory group members. again, we've mentioned it briefly, and I think most of you will be aware of the problem in the growth areas actually, but I've just put some headlines together from different newspapers, and some of them are older, but others are actually quite recent from this year. So we all know that growth areas have grown a lot in the last years, and that a lot of new homes have been added and will be added to those growth areas, and that infrastructure is really struggling to keep pace simply because there are so many new people. There are scarce local employment and services in those growth areas, and this means that for residents, often they have long commute times, and also they often travel by car, simply because other options are not as feasible or are not available. So public transport within the suburb is often absent, but yeah, so people have to go use a car to go to the train if they can use that. Trains can be overcrowded, although that might be a bit less of an issue with COVID, but often using public transport actually even increases commute times. So in a way, transport costs are externalized to households, and this has also health, social, and economic impacts, not just transport impacts. So really the question that we are dealing with, or that this project was dealing with, was how to achieve efficient public transport and infrastructure that supports active transport early on in the lifetime of the suburb. And we'll come to the early a bit later, explaining why we think that early delivery is particularly important. So we had four main approaches for the project. So we looked at the process of planning in Melbourne's growth areas with a focus on transport, obviously. So we did a document analysis and 30 semi-structured interviews with professionals involved in the process. We looked at the current situation and lived experiences in the growth areas. We did that through a resident survey and resident interviews, as well as a GIS analysis of the current situation. Then we looked at costs and benefits of early delivery of transport options, and Lucy will actually explain later what we did there. And then we looked at alternative funding options, assessing them against an evaluation framework to analyze their potential and ease of implementation. So these were the four main approaches. We'll try to talk about all of them. It was actually quite hard to select what to talk about because it has been such a long project. We hope we are not talking too much, but we think that all of what we are mentioning will be interesting. We had two case studies. So, and again, I won't talk too much about that because Diana and Carly will talk about the situation in Wyndham and Casey a bit more later. But within Wyndham, we looked at the PSP, Precinct Structure Plan, Dragonina South, and the Allura estate from Stockland, which is in that PSP. And in Casey, we looked specifically at the PSP Cranbourne East and the Landra Rise estate, which is within the PSP and is again a Stockland development. So we'll come back to what we did, what we analyzed in those case study sites later, but wanted to show you where they are. And then just briefly, so we have some outputs from the project. We have a final report with 11 recommendations, which we again will talk about later. We have a summary of findings, which is about 3 pages long, so that's a bit easier to read than, or quicker to read, better to say, than the final report. We have some briefing, working papers, policy briefs, and they're all up on our website, so you can have a look at them later. And now I'll hand over to Diana from City of Wyndham to say a few words.
Thanks, Annette. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm speaking to you from. That's the Bunurong people. And Wyndham City itself is located on the traditional lands of the Wadawurrung and the Bunurong people. So Annette's given you a little bit of an overview of the growth area context. And in the Wyndham context, absolutely the overarching theme or challenge around transport is limited transport choice. There's very high car ownership and quite a lot of congestion on the road, certainly at the peak times. The challenges in addressing that situation are limited bus services or timely delivery of bus-capable roads where the new estates are being built out in the new suburbs. We were really pleased about the recent budget announcements regarding new routes in Tarneet North, new bus routes. And as I said, a current challenge is related to the delivery of the fixed routes of those bus services and the need to have the bus capable roads in place to enable this. There are often challenges between different developers delivering different parts of the municipality. There's great opportunities for growth areas with demand responsive transit. We're thinking that there's a potential for them to operate in an area rather than on fixed routes and utilise virtual bus stops. And we'd really welcome this style of service. And we're pleased to see it was referenced in the recently released state government bus plan with a desire to trial and innovate. The other challenge in a place like Wyndham, where you've got the regional rail loop line coming through the northwestern part of the municipality, is that there are currently 2 stations, but there are still quite a few train stations to be built. So the state's big build projects include the Western Rail Plan and the western end of the suburban rail loop. They'll be transformative for our city with increased train capacity and metro style services. At the moment, we know Tarneit Station, probably not during COVID, but prior to COVID, the demand on that service was extreme in and around Tarneit Station, certainly Wyndham Station. So we hope to see new stations built along the regional rail loop that will enable communities to access the train services, and it will unlock significant potential and benefits for the suburbs around those stations. And integration with other modes such as buses and active transports, obviously going to be really important. Wyndham's recently adopted a new active transport strategy that was late last year, and that aspires for Wyndham to become the active transport leader of Victoria. There's huge potential to deliver a well-connected city and ensure active travel is a genuine mode of choice for our community. The regional rail loop, as I mentioned, runs to the northwestern side of the municipality. We've also got the original line that runs through to Werribee. As part of the active transport strategy, we've completed a missing links audit and a citywide network plan, and Council invested $4 million towards the program this year, including $1.5 million from the Australian government to get on with delivering these critical links. So that's where Wyndham's at with transport, rapidly growing municipality and really struggling for transport services to keep up with the demand. In terms of Wyndham's role on the advisory group over the last, I think, almost 3 years, and I'll have to acknowledge Mark Marsden, who was the first Wyndham representative on the group, but it's been a really positive experience. It's been a great opportunity with the meetings and the information flow to collaborate between state and local government. Sometimes that can be difficult. Developers and other sector representatives who are on the advisory group. We found the research was really innovative, comprehensive, and for a place like Allura, really valuable with great practical value. And as independent data and observations, it's something that is additional to the research and the work that Wyndham does in our municipality. The Wyndham 2040 vision has recently been refreshed, and transport continues to be up there as a major concern for the community. So having academic and independent contributions to the discussion really helps validate much of what the community is telling council. And as I said, the evidence is really valuable for council in its advocacy efforts. So that's me. Thanks for the opportunity to speak.
Thanks, Di. And then I'll hand over to Carly from Casey.
Thanks, Annette. Casey, Carly Goodrich from City of Casey and Head of Infrastructure and Facilities Planning, fairly new to the project, so I'd like to acknowledge the staff from Casey if they're online, Joe Nosgard, Stephanie Davies and a number of others that were involved in the project. I'd also like to start with acknowledging the traditional owners, Casey's Aboriginal communities and their rich culture, and pay respect to their elders past, present and future. And we acknowledge Aboriginal people as Australia's first peoples and as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we work and live and where I'm coming from today. For Casey, much like Wyndham, we're a massive growth area. Our population is over 360,000 at the moment, and we're growing to 550,000 by 2041, and with 4 new precinct structure plan areas or new growth areas to be planned for over the next couple of years, so it will be even beyond that population. Our development of residential estates is not necessarily sequential and results in new communities being isolated from services and facing continued road and service development and a really high car dependency. We've also got an extensive network of north, south and east-west arterial roads that are at varying stages of development, and limited public and active transport services are provided, particularly as you move further out of the established areas of our municipality. And whilst the stage of road may be developed through those estates, it's not usually at its ultimate capacity. So there's inconsistencies and poor outcomes for not only road and car use, but more importantly for our shared paths, bicycle lane connections, and then bus services. We also have a considerable amount of major road and level crossing removal projects happening across the municipality, and that's only adding to the congested road network. We know that the ultimate goal is to improve car and non-car experiences, and we're certainly, one of our key major advocacy projects will be the Cranbourne line extension to Clyde, which meets up with that major growth that's happening across Casey for that alternate transport. It's really interesting, and this is probably similar to a lot of local governments. We bear the brunt of complaints from residents where those major projects are occurring, and this opportunity to be involved in the partnership project with RMIT, BPA, Wyndham, Stockland and other partners to consider the problem of early delivery and equitable and healthy transport options in new suburbs was really appetising. Our case study area in Salandra Rise in Cranbourne East has had a range of early delivery of infrastructure, and the majority of that estate is now built out. So we've got that long-term academia supporting some of those interventions that we've provided there with Stockland. We have a real interest in understanding our community's lived experience in our new residential estates, particularly to inform our planning and partnerships for improved transport outcomes for our residents. And the qualitative feedback has provided insights on that lived experience, rather than, you know, a potential assumption from our planner perspective or sitting in our roles that we do without living in those areas. We also had a really keen interest on the measure on the cost impact on people's health and wellbeing, and where we can change or intervene the way we do things moving forward. The other interest area is really that cost benefit and funding options for early delivery of transport infrastructure and services, and that flow on for early year delivery of community infrastructure and activity centres. And we've certainly had a focus here on Casey on doing that for our infrastructure that we're responsible for delivery, which can include community facilities, active recreation reserves, and working with our developers like Stockland to have early interventions for the road and path networks. We're interested in understanding more around works in kind and what are the benefits that we can get out of that. And we've got a new area of research that we'll start undertaking for interim facilities in our growth areas. So we're not providing the ultimate built outcome for a community facility, but rather something that's interim that can be managed by and used by people moving into the estate earlier. Overall, it's been a really valuable experience as a partner, much like Di said, for the project, providing evidence and through research, coming together with the stakeholders from state and local government, the industry, developers and academia has been a real benefit. And we look forward to further opportunities with that, continue to share the findings more broadly, which I think is going to be really important, and then the next steps on the recommendations. From a Casey perspective, our integrated transport strategy and walking and riding Casey strategy will continue to underpin progress and using this research to shift and change the way we do things to have better outcomes for our community. And I appreciate the time for being able to share that information with you. Back to you, Annette.
Thanks, Carly. And thanks, Diana. Again, I think, yeah, that's really shows a really good background and gives, more information about how the situation is out in the growth areas. And it actually sets up quite well for what I'll be talking about now, the planning process and current situation in Melbourne's growth areas. And what we did in that part of the project, I mentioned it briefly before. So we did a document analysis. We looked at the precinct structure planning process for new suburbs. So that included a document analysis. And I have to say, we mostly looked at the current PSP, precinct structure planning guidelines, while we added the new draft guidelines, which came out last year. So we had a look at them, but our really detailed analysis was more on the current ones. And I think the new draft guidelines will be finalized soon, so they'll be the new current guidelines. So we looked at that, but we also looked or talked to professionals within the process. So we did 30 interviews, as I said, with government agencies, but also developers and consultants to try to understand what the situation is for lending for transporting growth areas. And then for the current situation, we did the GIS analysis that I talked about earlier. So to actually understand what is out there under the ground. So we have the plans, but what is actually implemented. So there were the 3 things we did here. And really, what you can say is the precinct structure planning process has definitely improved coordination. So since it has been introduced in 2006, coordination has improved between different stakeholders, local government, state government, developers, etc. So that is actually good. And it also incorporates a range of priorities relevant for encouraging active public transport. So what we looked at here, there are certain elements which are set in research, or which research found that they are conducive to walking, cycling, and the use of public transport. And they are local destinations, mixed land uses, dwelling densities, and street connectivity, and some others, but they are the most important ones. And they are actually all in the guidelines. We would say that the density targets are probably a bit low, but otherwise most elements are in the guidelines, and some of the objectives are actually quite ambitious. So in that sense, the plans or the objectives are good, but the question is now, well, how does it get implemented? Because that process does not control delivery. So there are plans, but what happens later? And that's so. One thing is timing of delivery, and that was one of our main aspects, obviously. So the PSP targets are really for the final build out. So if there is a target, for example, that 80 to 90% of households should be within 1 kilometer of an activity center or supermarket, that's the aim for when it's finally built out. But the question is, of course, but what happens before completion? So what happens to the residents who live there in the early years? And from our analysis, we can say, so there is actually an early delivery of foot and cycle path, because they are usually developed during, well, while the houses are built. So they are developed by the developer. There's also a delivery of bus capable roads. So that means roads which are broad enough that a bus can actually go through. And the PSPs plan for those areas, for those roads, and plan for, well, which bus services could go through there. But the question is then, of course, when do they get there? And so for the active transport infrastructure, as I said, the foot and cycle paths are there, but then there are no, or the destinations are delivered later. So the town centers are usually delivered as one of the last elements in a PSP, which is because of viability reasons. So if a developer or a supermarket owner wants to build, obviously they will only come in when there are enough people around. But that means there is not really somewhere to go to. So you have the path, but yeah, you don't have really anywhere to go or cycle to. Similar with the public transport services. So they are also lagging. Usually they are implemented quite a few years after the first residents move in. And again, that's because, well, they're funded by state government, and there are obviously a lot of other priorities that those public transport services have to compete against. And, well, on the one side, other areas which also need public transport, but of course also other areas outside public transport. But this lagging implementation means that there's no alternative, or only a few alternatives to the car in the beginning for the residents who move in early. And just to highlight some of the results from our GIS analysis. So there are only 25% of dwellings within 400-meter walking distance of a bus stop in growth areas. So that's the growth areas that have been built or are partly built. And the aim is actually 95%. Also, you have to say that actually this is only really achieved in inner Melbourne areas, 95%. So probably middle suburbs wouldn't achieve that either. Then the other result is that only 4% of dwellings are within 1 kilometer of a supermarket in the mostly built up PSP areas. And that sounds like a really, really low number. But as I just mentioned before, often the town centers are built last. So Allura is actually one example where that is. So most of the houses are built, but the town center hasn't been built yet. So obviously all those residents are not within 1 kilometer of a supermarket. And that's why the number is so low. And I think it really mainly shows that the early delivery is lacking. So we really need to focus on the timing. And that's where sequencing comes in and concentration of development. And I thought, to give you a bit of a laugh, I tried to draw something. So I tried to show what we mean by sequenced or concentrated development and non-sequenced development. And in a way, so you have several growth fronts on the left where you don't have sequence development. So you have several growth fronts where you are everywhere. People who live there need a community hub, they need a school, they need a supermarket. So of course that's difficult to implement all at the same time. Whereas with sequence development, you really try to focus on certain areas and finish them first, then go to the next one, which then makes it a bit easier to actually finish an area and provide a community hub. So you only have to provide one community hub and not 4, or you don't have to decide between different areas. So that's really the idea of that. And Plan Melbourne actually talks about that. It talks about that development and growth areas should be sequenced and staged. And there are also some first steps for planning for sequencing of state infrastructure within government. But the problem is a lot of it is internal. So no one outside of government knows what the plan actually is. And that's where we say, well, it should be a public document so that actually people know what the sequencing of state infrastructure is, what the plan is. And we understand that that's, of course, a bit difficult because it gets very political and contested. But if those plans would be public, then, for example, local government could actually match their funding accordingly. And that last point is really that there is more coordination or commitment needed overall for growth areas planning. So that was the part on the process, and I'll hand over now to Steve Pemberton, who will talk a bit more about the early delivery and why the project was focused on that. So Steve, over to you.
Thanks very much, Annette. So I'm Steve. I joined this project early last year. I've mostly been working on aspects of the costs and benefits alongside Lucy and Annette and Robin. This particular segment that I'm going to talk about today is on behaviour change, and it's concerning really one of our modelling assumptions. The question is, will active and public transport be used more, and so will more benefits be derived from them if they're made available when people move in instead of being provided several years later? So that is, for any given quality of public and active transport, whether it be medium, whether it be high, for any given quality, can we move from the left chart to the right chart, a little more active and public transport use, a little less car use, if we provide the facilities early? Intuitively, it certainly makes sense that we can make that assumption, but our question is whether there's evidence to support it. What we did was look to the academic literature, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. To give you a preview, there's plenty of academic support for the concept that there's an uplift, but there's very little guidance as to the size of the uplift. I should say that we haven't filled these slides with a lot of references to tell you which particular studies we're talking about, but that is all in a working paper which is available on request. So the academic literature focuses on what's called the habit discontinuity theory. Now, the habit discontinuity theory says that frequently performed behaviour in a stable context is unlikely to be spontaneously reconsidered. For example, you don't wake up every day and make a fresh decision about whether car or bus is the best way to get to work. Instead, you follow your habits. But where the context has changed, you're more likely to reconsider behaviour and form new habits, though you can drift back to old habits over time. The literature identifies life change events which are context changes, which are likely to trigger reconsideration of travel mode habits. They include changes in household size, or employment changes, or education changes. Then there's residential relocation. The studies find that moving house is associated with a change in travel habits, but the relocation itself doesn't seem to be the trigger. It's rather the other events, enlarging the family or getting a new job or retiring and so on, that happen around the same time as moving house, that are the triggers for the change in travel behaviour. So the analysis is that relocation might not be a trigger, but relocation does mark a time when travel habits are more likely to change because of the things going on at the same time. So the next thing to talk about is timing. On to the next slide. If habit change is more likely around the time of a residential relocation, then how long does that effect last? The literature uses the term window of opportunity to talk about this period during which habit change is more likely. And there's one group of studies that look at relocation and focus on the effect of the different travel facilities that are in the area you move to. And, you know, that I've put up several different ways in which it's expressed in different studies, but they all seem to coalesce on this idea that adaptive change continues to occur over 1 to 2 years after you move to a new house. That's the period during which you're likely to form the new habits as a result of the life change events. There's a different set of studies that look at smaller interventions like handing out free travel passes. So these studies find that the interventions are more effective if they're done at the time of relocation rather than a different time. But the window for that kind of thing might only be a few weeks or months. So it seemed to us that it was the former group of studies, the ones that dealt with responses to the difference in the actual facilities rather than response to information provided about them, that was more relevant to what we were looking at. What uplift can we assume? So that is, we concluded that from the literature, we concluded that active and public transport facilities will have a larger impact if they're provided within 1 to 2 years after residents move in rather than later on. So as a result of this, we've got a range of studies that let us know that there are a number of factors that influence the level of active and public transport use. So there's the built environment, including availability and frequency of public transport, and also including factors like density, street connectivity, land use mix. There's attitudes and preferences. Some people are motivated to use active and public transport for environmental reasons or whatever, if they can. That means different people are going to react to the facilities in different ways. Then the social factors, what are the people around you doing? And to this we can add timing, whether the facilities are provided within the window of opportunity rather than later on. So all those things combine to influence whether the blue bar will be bigger or smaller. So the next step is quantifying the effect of early delivery as a factor separate from availability and frequency of service and all the other things on that previous slide. And that one turned out not to be easy from the literature. The ideal study would do 3 things that are listed here. It would consider a significant change in active or public transport facilities rather than like providing new bus services rather than an information campaign about them. It would compare the effect on people who had moved and people who hadn't. And it would consider medium or long-term effects, say at least 12 months. Now, sadly for us, no one seems to have done a study just like that. Maybe that could be our next project, but no one seems to have done a study just like that. On the rest of this slide and the next one, though, we'll talk about a few things we did find that helped us reach some kind of assumption to adopt in our modelling. The first thing to note is that if everything aligns, the level of change that you can see can be extremely high. We're not going to say that we assumed the figures that you see here, but this is where everything goes really well. So when the World Wildlife Fund moved its London office from one town outside London to another similar town, car commuting dropped from 50%, 25% after that move. That's a 50% drop in car commuting. What the authors said was that they saw this as reflecting the high environmental attitudes of employees. They were all people who worked for World Wildlife Fund, so they were supposed to be environmentalists. And the relocation, this was a workplace relocation rather than residential, but the relocation gave them the opportunity or triggered them to activate their attitudes and drive less. Another study we looked at was some of university students in Los Angeles who compared students who had moved house to students who hadn't moved house. And they found much higher likelihoods, 39% or 55%, of using public or active transport among the students who had moved. But partly that was because they'd often moved to areas with better public transport. You were kind of comparing the people who'd moved to live closer to the university to the people who were still living further away, maybe with their parents. So this is an example of a study that doesn't disentangle service quality from the relocation uplift, but it also shows that you can get a very high level of difference between people who've moved and people who haven't moved in the right circumstances. And when I say between people who've moved and people who haven't moved, if we apply that to a growth area, what we're talking about is between people who have just moved into the growth area versus people who have been living there for a long time and have already formed their car habits when the bus finally arrives, if it's not delivered early. So moving on to the next one, this I'll spend a bit of time on this graph because it's one that we found a bit interesting. It's from a large-scale UK study, a longitudinal household survey of about 40,000 people. What they found was that the likelihood of commuting by car increased with the time living at your address. So the probability of commuting by car is 54% for people who've just moved in. It increases to 60% after 1 year, to 64% after 10 years, and eventually stabilising at 67%. The authors analysed, similar theme to before, the authors analysed this as people activating their pro-environmental intentions and not driving when they first move in, with that link between intentions and behaviour weakening over time. So these are the figures that come from a large study across multiple parts of the UK, rather than just tracking movement into places that have better public or active transport. So to some extent, by combining moves between a lot of different types of areas, it's a study that you can see as separating out the relocation effect from the built environment effect. These are people reacting to what's happening when they move, rather than all people who've moved to somewhere with better transport. We thought perhaps we could derive some useful insights from the differences over time that we see here. So we're looking at this gap between the 54% and the 67%. That's 13% of the total sample, or it's 19% of the 67% who are long-term drivers. That gap we thought we could see as the people who are up for grabs, the people who might sort of stick to their proactive or public transport intentions if the facilities were there to support it. And that gap is, you know, as I said, starts out at 19% of the long-term drivers. Even after 10 years, you've still got 5% of the long-term drivers, or 10% of the non-drivers, are still not driving. I've thrown around a lot of percentages there, and I guess we need to keep in mind the distinction between the percentage of drivers who are being diverted and the uplift, which is sort of what we're looking for, and the uplift in the non-driving group. So if you've got 6% of the total sample, that is about 10% of the drivers. It's about 20% of the non-drivers. Now, we've thrown around here a whole lot of figures. I think in the last two slides I've said 50 and 33 and 39 and 10 and 19 and so on. So yeah, it is time to go to the next slide, where I have to admit that did not exactly give us a neat finding from any one study that we wanted, but it did ultimately lead us to conclude that a fairly conservative assumption would be to assume that for a given level of transport quality, there would be an uplift of 10% in the number of people using it if it were provided within the first couple of years after they arrived, rather than being provided later. So I need to explain, I'm not talking about 10% of the total sample. Instead, if 25% could be expected to use active or public transport with a given quality of service, we'd assume that instead of 25%, it would be 27.5% who would use it if it were provided early. There might be another level of quality where we would think it's so good that normally 50% would use it. And then if we provided it early, we'd apply that 10% and say, so 55% would use it. And that's the uplift that we have adopted in the modelling of benefits that Lucy will talk about shortly. I'll just close on a side note, really. It's a very interesting study that found that the public transport environment where you live, this is a study from the US, the environment where you live during your late 20s and early 30s is a strong predictor of your future public transport use. In fact, they said that for people in their 40s, 50s and 60s, the quality of public transport where you lived when you were 30 has twice the effect on your current travel habits than the environment where you now live. And the reason this matters is because of the growth profile and the age profile in growth areas. These are population pyramids drawn from the 2016 census, and you can see that bulge in the left for growth areas. That bulge is for people aged 30 to 34 who are significantly overrepresented in growth areas compared to Greater Melbourne. 25 to 34-year-olds in growth areas, in Greater Melbourne are 16% of the population, but they're 22% of the population in growth areas. They are, they have a bulge of people around that age with young kids. The reason this is important is that, if we set habits in growth areas using the sort of early delivery dividend, then those habits might be, or can probably be expected to be longer lived than habits set in other areas with fewer people in that age group. So delivery of stuff early in growth areas is important, not just because they need it there, but also because it may have even more effect in the long term delivering it there compared to other places where you don't get that age benefit. And that brings me to the end of this section, which I think means handing back to Annette.
Yes, thanks, Steve. And could I maybe remind everyone to mute themselves, because I sometimes have some background noises. So yeah, we'll go to the residents now, which kind of flows over from what Steve just said. So the 30 to 34-year-olds, although we talked to, of course, everyone. So we did the resident survey and the interviews that I mentioned earlier. I should mention that they were done in 2019. So they were done before the pandemic, before working from home hit. So a lot of it is more the experience of actually long commutes that I talked about before. And maybe just as background, so the resident survey, we had 352 valid responses, and we did 30 interviews, so 15 interviews in Wyndham, 15 interviews in KC with people. I think the age from 19 to 75, I didn't note it up, but around that. So we talked to different people, and I just would like to highlight a few results from the survey and the interviews. So as you can see here, for 69% of respondents, travel times are actually longer than they expected when moving into the suburb. And when we actually talked to people in the interviews, some of them said, well, we knew that it would be long travel time, so we didn't expect it to be really quick, but it's still a lot longer than we thought. So yeah, most people are surprised or surprised by the longer travel times. And these travel times then also impact on their family life and the health. So 64% said that travel times have a negative impact on their family life, whereas 48% said that they have a negative impact on their health. And with that negative impact, so there is also, it's not just the travel times really, it's more the unpredictability of the travel times, which lead to increased stress. And that's obviously especially so when you need to arrive at a certain time somewhere. So for people having to start work at a certain time, they really feel stressed if they are somewhere and don't know how much longer it will take. So some people, to avoid this stress, they leave a lot earlier, but then if you actually get through, you have wasted a bit of time. So it's really this unpredictability which is influencing people a lot, and that can come from traffic congestion, but also poor public transport connections, or yes, just some incidences in the traffic network. When we asked people in the survey, they said that so 69% said that they have some restrictions in their day-to-day travel in the last 12 months. And of those said that 80% of that was from traffic congestion, 44% said that it was due to lack of public transport, and 39% said that public transport was not going where they needed. So yeah, that shows the transport situation. And I would like to come back to some quotes from the interviews or what people told us. So one thing is that, so this is really a lot about health and local destinations in a way. So it is about transport, but also local destinations. And one thing is that people said that foot and cycle paths are good for recreation, but they're disconnected to other areas. So they really appreciated that they could walk more. They liked the cycle path and the footpath in the area. But yeah, if there were no local destinations to walk to, they wouldn't use it for transport, but rather just for going for a walk. So we have some quotes here. So it's really, one person said, I mean, I can't even get over to the cafe over the road with a pram. It's just too dangerous. There's nothing there. It's not safe enough to go across, so I don't do it. That was in Allura. And then in Sileno Rise, someone said, yeah, the paths here, yeah, they are great paths, but they don't lead anywhere. So they advertise 5 kilometers of cycle path, but where do they go? Then the other thing, again, also related to local destinations in a way, is or the local town centers, is that accessibility to shops influences shopping behavior. And with greater distance, interviewees report that they buy less fresh food. And one of the reasons is because they go less often. And that's the other quote. So I find I do one weekly shop at the weekend. If I get home from work and I was to pop to the shops, it could take half an hour to get 5 kilometers away. So again, that shows how far the shops are at the moment, or were in 2019 in Allura, but also that because of the traffic, then people say, well, I'd rather go just once a week. But then they also say, well, I don't buy fresh food or as much fresh food because it might not be fresh at the end of the week. So we can see other impacts on health, not just from transport, although you can also see that, well, they can't, or they don't walk to the shops, so they don't get that specific positive impact from on health from active transport. And that's actually what Lucy will talk about next, about health benefits and other benefits. And I'll hand over to her to talk about the costs and benefits of the delivery of transport options.
Thank you very much, Annette. I would like to acknowledge, before I go on, my colleagues Annette, Kroen, Steve Pemberton and Robin Goodman for this work. It's very much a team effort, and it certainly took all of us to get it in the right place. We'll just go to the next slide. The key objectives really of this work were to be looking at the early delivery of transport options with the aim of calculating costs and benefits, but really focusing on the timing of the delivery. And with that in mind, we had a number of key questions. The first being, to what extent is earlier better and why? What are the benefits of the early delivery of these different types of transport options? How much more expensive is earlier delivery, and to what extent would sequencing of growth make a difference? So Annette's done a nice job of explaining a little bit about the sequencing, but I think there's a bit more we can add in here as well. So we'll just go to the next slide. So what we did to calculate the benefits and the costs was to generate a series of scenarios for walking, cycling and public transport. We did that by development stage, looking at 30, 60 and 90% development. And what that refers to is really how much of each of the estates in our case study were developed at each point in time. We developed those numbers, that 30, 60 and 90, by looking at satellite imagery of both the Allura case study and also Sileno Rise case study. And both instances, we did sort of notice that across a couple of years that there would be 30%, then another few years there'd be another 30%, which gives you the 60%, and then another few years later there'd be another 30%. So it seems to happen roughly in chunks of 30% across a couple of years. So we decided to use that information to develop the timing aspect of our project. In terms of the actual scenarios themselves, we also decided that the quality would be important to put in, because you can put in something that's fairly basic and it's functional, which is sort of a necessary but sufficient condition, or you could do something that's better, so putting in better infrastructure and a real Rolls-Royce version. So this is where we started to put in a low, medium and high sense of quality for the walking, cycling and public transport infrastructure for our scenarios. Now, it's easier said in this way, but what we did was create a set of principles, and we applied those principles to each of the case study areas. And it's actually a little bit easier to see it. So on the next slide, we've actually got that's it. We've got some maps showing what we did, and I'll just talk you through it to give you a sense of what it was that we were aiming to do. So we had our principles, and in this example here, very quickly, we're looking just at the walking infrastructure and just at 30% developed. And I'm hoping that you can see on the left-hand side that there are red sections inside the Allura estate. Those little red lines are indicative of the development segments. components. So components that were built at the time for the 30% developed. But the problem is across these 4 chunks of residential areas that have been built, there's no connectivity to any of the existing infrastructure. So our objective really was to allow people to walk to some basic amenity, which is the existing petrol station and convenience store, which is located in that bottom right-hand corner. So what we did in the low quality scenario is to put in one sidewalk, and that's what you see with those green lines going across the estate. In the medium scenario, we expanded that and we included sidewalks on one side of the street, but for the arterial roads surrounding the estate, but also adding in greater connectivity within the estate. The idea here is still that we're linking people to existing destinations, but we're giving them more options to access other types of transport. So it's often the case that your bus routes are on the periphery on arterial roads. And so our idea here was to get people, giving them accessibility essentially. In the third one, which is our high quality scenario, which is on the right-hand side, we decided to increase the walking infrastructure even more by putting in sidewalks on both sides of the street. And I think this speaks to the comment that Annette made about the woman not wanting to cross the road with her pram. So really, we wanted to make sure that people were safe and that they had a sidewalk to walk on, and hence we put it in on both sides of the street. This is also slightly different in our high quality scenario because we put in one sidewalk along the grass nature reserve, which is in the centre of the estate itself. So there's a one-sided walkway or walking path. Exactly. Thank you, Annette. She's got the mouse there, just showing where that is. Now, we also, for this high quality scenario, increased the amenity for the area by putting in a town centre because it turns out to be much easier to do it on paper. And so we decided we would do that to get a sense of the costing structure, but to really give people somewhere to go to, because there's quite a lot of research that shows that a lot of people do walk, and the key impetus for doing that is to access a destination of some sort. So we put in our town centre in the high quality scenario. So we just go to the next slide. So in building on that kind of process of applying our principles to our scenarios, we did something similar for cycling and public transport, but the key difference is that we allowed our cycle paths and also our bus routes to go outside of the estate, because cycling and buses, quite obviously, as many of you will know, are designed to go for further longer distances. So we won't look at cycling, but if we just jump to the next slide, I'll talk through what we did with public transport. So in our public transport scenarios, this actually shows the high quality scenario here, but I'll talk you through what we did with the low and medium, just so you get a sense of where we're aiming with it. It might be a little bit tricky to see, but around Williams Landing train station, there is a green bus line, and we allowed it to go up to the Wyndham Village Shopping Centre. And that was what we constituted as, or defined as, our low quality scenario. In our medium scenario, we added in the purple line, which gives accessibility to the internal part of the Allura estate itself. So the purple lines just in there. And then the high quality scenario, we added in the magenta line, which is actually running around the arterial roads up to Tarneet. And we also extended the green line up to Tarneet as well. So essentially, this map that you're seeing is the high quality scenario. If you just look at the map and look at the routes collectively, essentially we're linking in our bus routes to the key destinations, which is the shopping centre existing one, and also the new one that we were able to put in because it's so much easier to do on paper, and also to link in with those train stations, because those train stations take people to other destinations as well. So creating as much accessibility as possible, and also factoring in a little bit of equitable access, which is really what that purple bus line is designed to do. So allowing people to get to the bus if they can't necessarily walk to the arterial roads on the periphery of the estate. So we'll just go to the next slide. The kinds of costs that we included, the scenarios allowed us to calculate distances essentially for pathways and also for the cycle routes and the bus lines themselves, and we used that we used per kilometre costs for those, but the kinds of costs we included were pathways, maintenance, pedestrian crossings, costings for bridges and the town centre itself. For cycling, we used on-road cycle lanes, shared use paths, separated cycle paths, and some bike hoops. For buses, we included the capital costs of the bus, driver costs, fuel, servicing, tyres, insurance and bus stops. And for the benefits, we included health benefits, and this was an annualised and monetised health benefit developed from work by our colleague, Dr. Belen Zapata-Diamidi. So this is where the work from Steve was really, really important. It was integral to know what the number of people who would undertake more active transport would be, because that gives us the increment to the health benefits that we could factor in for our scenarios. We also included reduction in car ownership and also estimates for social participation. So when you do all that, you get the next slide, which is the actual costs and benefits monetised. So this is, I know this is quite probably an overwhelming slide because there's certainly a lot of numbers on there. We don't have time to go through all of them, so my apologies, but you can find these a summary of this in the final report and also in our working paper on the topic. But for those of you with keen eyes, the key thing to look at is really that the costs in the early delivery, early being the 30%, they're a bit higher than what they are for medium delivery, which is what you get in the second block of columns. And again, the costs start to decline in late delivery. So bringing in the costs early means that you're paying a premium for putting in infrastructure, but you're also getting relatively high benefits. And so this quadrant at the bottom with the red box around it is really what we're sort of seeking in this aspect of the project. What does it cost and what are the benefits of bringing in the early delivery of transport options? So early but higher quality delivery. So we might just jump to the next slide. And this is really just a summary of the key figures from that bottom quadrant. So for the benefits, we get $691 million in Allura and $925 million for Salandra Rise. The costs happen to be similar for both at around $59 million. The reason for that is that despite being quite different in shape, so Allura is relatively square, Salandra was kind of rectangular. It just turned out that their sizing and what they needed in order to create these scenarios happened to be similar. So the costing happened to be similar for both. The benefit cost ratios are around 11.7 and 15.7 respectively. This is greater than 1. So if you're getting, for every dollar cost you're putting in, you're getting around $12 and $16 respectively for benefits. So there's definitely a lot more benefits that we were able to estimate in our scenarios. Now, for the exercise of creating scenarios, we did extrapolate it to all of the growth areas and we got benefits of 24.1 billion. So sorry, we've missed off the wording there, and costs of 8.7 billion. So a benefit cost ratio of 2.75. Now, this is much lower, but there's a reason for that. We decided that it was very hard to include any spillover effects due to existing amenity that comes from having existing suburbs next to these growth areas across that development frontier for Melbourne. So to avoid double counting, we decided to just stick to the growth areas and look at the benefits that accrue to the population just in those growth areas themselves. And that's why that benefit cost ratio number is a lot lower. So we might just jump to the final slide. So the key findings from this, and this is my last slide, is that the early delivery of high quality transport options means that the costs are upfront, they come earlier, but the benefits actually accrue over time. And part of that reason is that you're giving the early adopters, the people who move in early, the maximum length of time across the project lifetime to accrue health benefits themselves. So you're picking up on that behaviour change, but you're giving people the maximum length of time in which to be healthy, essentially. The sequencing itself also matters for cost and benefit delivery. So I think Annette did a better job of explaining that than me, but the idea here is that if you've got lots of growth areas all being built at the same time, you can't build them quickly. Whereas if you have a limited number of growth areas being built, you can build them faster and you can concentrate that development so that you can put in things like your town centre, put in the transport earlier and faster, giving more benefit. We did find as part of this project that the benefits are really critical, but they're actually really hard to measure. There doesn't necessarily seem to be a lot of easy to use methods for calculating benefits. And a good example of this is health benefits. We're quite lucky to have a simplistic way of doing that here, but in other projects, there's more complicated models that look at developing health benefits. It's not an easy nut to crack. And finally, the location of developments within the estate also impacts that cost-benefit structure. And that really comes off the picture that I showed you in the beginning. Just looking at walking infrastructure, when you have those different development segments, it forces you to join them up in some way. That could be avoided if you concentrated where you built the houses in each of the estates themselves. So at this point, I think I'm going to finish up, say thank you for listening and hand you over back to Annette.
Thanks, Lucy. So the next topic. So we've just heard, I think it was 24.1 billion that we need. So what we did, we looked at alternative funding options, just because as we just saw the early delivery or general the delivery of transport options is obviously expensive. And even, I mean, if we wanted to achieve the 95% of dwellings in Melbourne or the whole of Victoria, well, Melbourne, within 400 meters of a bus stop or 600 meters of a tram or 800 meters of a train, that would also already cost a lot of money. So what we did was looking at some alternative options which could potentially give some revenue that could be used for the delivery or the early delivery of transport options. And don't worry, I'm not going through the whole figure here. That was just really the example of how we did evaluate those funding options. So what we did, we looked at beneficiary charges, which are the transport pricing and including elements like public transport fares, road user charges, parking charges. We looked at user charges, which are betterment levy, local developer contributions, and state infrastructure contributions. And property development is a bit of an odd one out, so it's right. And then we looked at general revenue, which include property and land tax, sale tax, employment tax, and fuel tax. So these were options which we thought would be quite promising. And we had a look then according to their potential revenue. So how much money would they actually bring, or well, what, yeah, how much money, let's say that. If you implement them, what's the reliability? So that refers to, is it actually a recurrent charge or is it maybe a one-off charge? So that wouldn't be that reliable. Then equity. So we looked at horizontal equity, which means that people in similar economic circumstances are treated equally and costs are borne by those who benefit. And vertical equity, which means that people of different economic means and abilities are treated differently. So in that sense, low economic households don't have to pay the same share as high economic households. We looked at the ease of implementation. So how easy is it actually to implement that in Victoria? And travel impacts. So some of those funding options actually have an impact on travel behavior, whereas others haven't. And we looked at the time frame, and that's is it able, could it be implemented in the short term, medium term, or long term? And the results from that is really, so the most promising options are the ones, just a moment. I had to switch on my plug. The most promising options are the ones that are the most difficult to implement. So transport pricing and a broad-based land tax are the ones that were the most promising. They provide recurrent, stable, and equitable funding, at least if you put in some measures for the vertical equity. And transport pricing additionally impacts on travel behavior. So that's why we think that they are both the most promising ones, but they also would both require significant change to current regulation, and therefore they are not short-term solutions. Options that could be pursued as more immediate solutions include betterment levies, payroll tax, expanded parking charges, and to some extent infrastructure contributions. So betterment levies do capture value, and in the absence of a broad-based land tax, they would be a very feasible measure. So the recently announced windfall gains tax, for example, which actually is for everything outside of growth areas, that was announced recently, is actually a form of a betterment levy. So that's what we are talking about here. And payroll tax, for example, is used in France as an effective instrument for funding public transport. And about 30% of public transport operations are funded through this tax there. And again, actually a similar payroll tax surcharge has recently been announced for Victoria to provide funding for mental health and well-being. So they could be feasible options. Infrastructure contributions, I said there to some extent. And that's mainly because they are one-off payments, so they are not a recurrent income, although with the growth areas infrastructure contribution, which I'll talk about in a minute, that's actually a really large amount of money so that it still provides, and it goes over quite a bit of time so that it still provides enough funding. But infrastructure contribution plans, which are for the local infrastructure contributions, they are really, well, they can help for local active transport infrastructure, but public transport services are largely out of scope. So that's why they are not as fitting. So the potential for infrastructure contributions, so it will bring some local active transport infrastructure, but it won't be able to fund public transport. But the potential is really that they could actually bring forward some infrastructure to improve connectivity, such as intersections, paths, or bridges. So, for example, these improve street connectivity could enable a bus to run through a suburb rather than along its boundary, because sometimes that's actually the problem with the buses. So not all of the roads are built, so the bus can't go through, so you can't put in a bus. So that's sometimes what delays public transport services. And if in the infrastructure contribution plans, this infrastructure is prioritized so that you can actually achieve a connectivity earlier, that would already help a lot. That doesn't really have to do with funding, but that's really the potential that the infrastructure contributions plan may have. And they do have these types of infrastructure development in there anyway, but at the moment there's no explicit focus on the transport network outside the PSP and the issues of connectivity. So that's why we suggest to try to bring forward some of the infrastructure. Then I already mentioned, so the GAIC could be used for some of the funding, especially, well, in Victoria we have the GAIC. In other states or countries that's actually not the case, so that's something which is quite fortunate here. And the GAIC has a public transport fund and a community fund. So the public transport fund is for infrastructure and operations. And operations means that 5 years of recurrent public transport services can be funded, and that is already done. But historically, there's really more focus of transport infrastructure. Whereas we think these 5 years of recurrent public transport services are really a good opportunity to kickstart bus services, which are the crucial backbone of public transport service in growth areas. And their early operation would enable future residents to move in without the requirement for every adult in a household to own a car, and it would deliver environmental, social, and economic benefits. And therefore, we suggest to focus the GAIC more strongly on the early operations of public transport services. The community fund, so that's really for capital works and land for community infrastructure like health, education, libraries, but also active transport infrastructure, so transport infrastructure for walking and cycling. We think that if those could be implemented early, then again, it could support the early delivery of a neighborhood center, providing useful destinations to walk and cycle to within the suburb. Of course, a library or a community hub will not be the one thing where everyone walks to. So that's why I've put in cooperation here. It's really important to cooperate between the different stakeholders who are all interested in putting something there. And from conversations with developers, we actually know that there's interest in coordinating with other stakeholders, such as service providers and local government, to provide some early delivery of smaller hubs in their estates. And that could, for example, be the combination of a display center with a cafe or convenience store or a child care center. So these are really some ideas for the early delivery of some destinations. And then, well, the last thing for the GAIC is that it is also partly a betterment charge. So state government could actually assess whether the current GAIC rate reflects the value of betterment adequately. So this was the run through most of our findings. And before I come to the recommendations later, I'll hand over to the members of our advisory group again. And I'll ask Tim Westcott to share his thoughts on some of the findings on the projects, etc. I hope you're there, Tim.
Yes, I am. Thanks, Annette. Yeah, thanks so much for having me along today, and congratulations to the team on all their work. I just want to also acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people whose country I'm on, and extend my respect to their elders past and present. Yeah, look, I'm, for people who don't know, I'm one of the vice presidents of the Planning Institute's Victorian division, and I've been the representative of the Victorian Committee on this project for the last few years. And this project, I guess, I just want to say, it fits in very well with, I guess, PIA's objectives, and the current committee's really had a strong focus on this of trying to better link research and practice. And I think this project's a really great example of that. Yeah, for those who don't know, PIA has in the last 18 months developed a research strategy, which is, I guess, a step towards trying to identify key research focuses for the planning profession. And we've also set up an MOU with RMIT, which aims to both better promote research and sort of connect research and planning practice, and also, I guess, identify, I guess, opportunities for researchers to work on things that are of interest to the planning profession. And I think this project's a really good example of that, and hopefully you've seen that through some of the findings that Annette's talked about already today. I guess from our point of view, we're really excited this project has been cross-disciplinary, so it's brought together people from state government, from councils, from development industry together, and I think that's, and as well as academics, obviously, and to look at solutions to real world problems that planners are facing, and in particular, a really big issue for Melbourne, which has been talked about for so long, about how you get transport into growth, better transport into growth areas. I think a really great part of this project is it has been sort of holistic in its the way it's tackled the issue. So it's looked at, as you've seen, a whole, I guess, transport issues. It's looked at, health and economic issues. It's tackled cost benefit. And it's also sort of got into an analysis of what sort of planning systems and tools are out there at the moment. So I think, that has real, actual practical benefits for the planning profession and for, for all stakeholders going forwards in this, and hopefully, provides the opportunity for government to, to change and improve its practices in delivering infrastructure as well. So, I think, it really sort of sums up, I think a lot of things that, PIA advocates for, and we're really pleased to have been part of it. That's probably all I really need to say at this point. But yeah, congratulations again to the team, and we'll obviously be working with, in the spirit of our MOU, be working with the RMIT team to help disseminate the results of this study to practitioners. And there's, I know there's a range of great resources the team has on their website, which I'm sure Annette will talk about as well. So thanks again for the opportunity to be part of the project.
Thanks a lot, Tim. And yes, we're looking forward to disseminate the results further. Paul Cassidy from the Victorian Planning Authority, if you could come online, thanks. Paul. Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Annette, and all. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land of which I reside, which is also the Wurundjeri people today. Just for those who may not be particularly familiar, so the VPA is responsible for strategic planning and infrastructure planning coordination in designated urban growth areas across Victoria, and particularly had its roots in greenfield planning. And my background, my role is Director Streamlining. I've also spent a lot of my time in greenfields planning over the last 10 years, since the first PSP guidelines were finalised over 10 years ago. As the primary producer of precinct structure plans, of which this study, looked at, focused on a couple in particular, we've got a keen interest in, better understanding how they're being implemented and whether the objectives and aspirations of the plans are actually being achieved. And I'd also like to, probably echoing Tim's comments, we certainly appreciated the willingness, the advisory group, and the willingness to engage and debate, and just in terms of the researchers, and actively considering and seeking views from practitioners in industry regarding, issues that can be contentious. And I think and they're difficult to resolve. And I think the reports and the findings indicate that it is a complicated space, but that shouldn't stop us from striving to get better at how we do it. And some of that complexity, which is either directly picked up in the report or alluded to, the economic viability and cash flow for developers is a significant issue. Particularly, for example, the rollout of town centres, the whole affordability equation. I think it's interesting findings about relative upfront affordability versus long-term livability is a really important aspect of the debate. It's certainly, in terms of sequencing, there's a fine balance between having a competitive market, and competition amongst the development industry, which deliver the new communities, versus having a limited number of growth fronts. So there's a constant tension there. Again, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking harder at how we do that. The thing regarding the interesting thing that I found, and I think it's useful with the evidence base that's been building up in this report, it really shows up some of the issues regarding not just sequencing, but which but the use of the word sequencing can indicate that there might be something that we can easily do about it. But what we call fragmented land ownership, which is often we have structural plan areas with a large number of landowners, and you could have a landowner that is perfectly entitled with to not develop, creating essentially a break in a network that's emerging. So it's something we probably, as a planning authority, need to be thinking about it is, are there other ways, are there other tools we can use to try and get some of that connectivity in earlier, which would help alleviate some of the issues that the researchers have found. And of course, the competition for state and local government funds, cash flow for contributions, and I think again the researchers have tried to produce recommendations regarding these issues, but and making the case for early investment that it has longer term benefits and longer term savings, but there are I call chicken and egg issues in here in terms of creation of destinations, delivery of transport up front, and delivery of density. They're interrelated. So again, the research it adds to the thinking. So I found certainly reading through it very interesting, and certainly a lot of food for thought, and maybe about how we can continue to improve. In terms of the recommendations, just a couple of thoughts. So within our remit, the VPA is committed to increasing densities in new communities, and the yet to be released, but hopefully soon, PSP guidelines, the updated PSP guidelines, will certainly be focusing on improved densities as well as housing diversity, which we think go hand in hand, better housing choices. And we also, I think the early delivery or the preliminary delivery, I think was the term in the recommendations of neighbourhood and town centres, I think is a really interesting proposition, and one that I think could be explored with some willing developers to try to say, well, what if we were of a mind to, try and go in the direction, what could that look like? And I think that that whole approach to interim delivery of destinations to help manage the financial and cash flow issues that everyone faces in this space is something worth looking at, and maybe trying to embed. I know even Solander Rise, Casey introduced the Solander Rise, I can't remember the term for it, but it was a community house, I think, early on, which was certainly a success. I suppose how can we maybe trial some of these things, and if they're successful, how can we embed them? I think it's an important thing. So looking at, in conclusion, again, well done to researchers. I think that they're certainly, from our perspective, an important contribution, and food for thought, and provide an evidence base for us to, as practitioners, to explore improvements in the way that we plan for and implement new communities. So thanks for the opportunity, Annette.
Thanks, Paul. And yeah, you raised definitely some really important points there with the fragmented land ownership the chicken and egg issue and the housing diversity, and I hope we can maybe discuss a little bit later as well in the Q&A. So Kath Phelan from Infrastructure Victoria.
Thanks, Annette. I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people as the traditional owners of the land on which I am currently working. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. As with my colleagues who've been on this project, I really appreciated the opportunity to be involved. It has been a terrific experience to have academics, local government, state government, development industry, the Planning Institute around the table. At Infrastructure Victoria, we really value this type of applied research that has immediate public policy relevance, and especially because we have a strong interest in this relationship between transport modes and land uses. And while we focus on the planning side, we're always very interested in implementation. I think this project has really highlighted some of the challenges and alternative ways of thinking about those. I am, rather than giving a whole lot of feedback on the project, I'm actually going to use this as a bit of an opportunity to spruik our own work, as we've just released our final strategy after getting some feedback on our draft, which we released back in December last year. We had fantastic response in our engagement program, and so our final strategy has 94 recommendations, and it does include a new one in the final strategy that wasn't in the draft that recommends provision of libraries and aquatic centres in growth areas, because we see that there's a real issue and a funding gap there for those facilities which very much can act as important destinations in growth areas. We also, in the final strategy, have some more detail on transport recommendations, particularly as a result of doing some transport modelling. We're very fortunate now to have both the use of the Victorian Integrated Transport Model and our own econometric model that allows us to look at how people and jobs move around Victoria in response to some of these big transport projects. So some of the recommendations that I think are of sort of tangential interest to this project, but probably for this audience, we have a recommendation around road management systems, which looks at the better use of existing road networks to improve the performance, particularly of suburban arterials. So that's really getting out towards the growth areas. And it's interesting because of that interaction that Lucy talked about between what happens in the growth areas versus those outer suburbs that have existed for, say, 20 years. We have another recommendation that talks about rail electrification and service improvements into the growth areas. And just to note also, we have one on reconfiguring the city loop that also has growth area benefits as well. We've recommended next generation bus services to actually occur before some of the growth area rail extensions. So, for example, to Clyde and Alert into the growth areas, and also down at Baxter, down on the Mornington Peninsula. We do have a recommendation about an outer metropolitan ring road and freight rail. So that one might be an interesting one to have a look at, because that sort of connects up all of Melbourne's growth corridors. And then finally, we do talk about off-peak discounts for public transport fares as well. So I think that might have a bit of a relationship too with this project. So thank you again for the opportunity. It really has been just terrific. And I really look forward to seeing what the team comes up with as their next research project. Thanks, Annette.
Thanks, Kath. Yeah, and actually, so we'll come to the recommendations, which some of them I think overlap slightly with the Infrastructure Victoria ones. But before I go there, I again would like to thank the advisory group members. One thing that they were willing to present with us here, but really for the good discussions. I think it has really raised the quality of the project to have practitioners on board who can actually give feedback on, well, some ideas. Sometimes the researchers are maybe not that realistic or don't see some of the real life problems. So it was really good to have this feedback. But now I'll go on to the recommendations that we developed from our work. And I'll go through them and explain them briefly. So there are 11, so you have to wait a bit more. But so our first recommendation is a base level of public transport service and provision for active transport be considered essential in growth areas from the time residents move in. And that actually refers to being essential just as electricity, water, and roads are seen as essential. So they are infrastructure and, well, mainly infrastructure that are have to be delivered because they're essential ones. And we say that a base level of public transport is also an essential service, and that's in that case. And one of the, well, our main argument for that is really that mobility is a precondition for participation in society, which includes work, education, care, health, cultural and social life, and is central to the quality of life. So that's also why we put it in when we calculated it in our costs and benefits analysis. So we put in the benefits of social and economic participation, because we think that's one of the really essential points of public transport, to provide access to people who don't have access to a car or who can't drive. So they might be teenagers, but maybe there are also others. So, for example, we talked with someone in the interviews who was losing their eyesight. So they were actually a captive public transport user. And yeah, there are people out there like that. So we have to have a basic level of public transport service. The difference is, of course, when you look at electricity and water or sewage, that public transport is generally provided through the state and has to compete with other budget priorities, as I said earlier. So still, we say, nevertheless, there should be a minimum. And I'll come back to that in one other recommendation. So the second recommendation is establish a more coordinated and strategic approach towards the development of growth areas through state infrastructure plans that support sequencing of development. And I've talked about that earlier. So why we think that sequencing of development is important. And that, well, there should be public state infrastructure plans. So the common approach of planning in the growth areas through the precinct structure planning. So I want to say there is a common approach within state government, because there is more coordination, as we talked about earlier, but there's still the need for greater collaboration and integrated thinking in growth areas planning. So there's no whole of government strategic approach, and coordination within state government is sometimes difficult because many departments and agencies are involved in this kind of process, and often, obviously, or understandingly, they focus on their own objectives. So we think that maybe a specific agency with an appropriate level of authority could be given responsibility for ensuring the coordination of provisioning growth areas, so that there's really one agency which looks at growth areas and which brings everyone together, just to improve coordination. And I've talked about before that we think that there is an urgent need for a public plan for infrastructure investment, because that would improve the sequencing of infrastructure investment, and also the ability to match funding from the side of local government, but also for developers or residents. It would be beneficial if they have some kind of confidence to know what state infrastructure will be implemented where. And we understand that there is, of course, that this is very political, and that sometimes it might be hard to plan that far ahead, but it would really improve the process. Develop strategic transport plans to inform planning for growth areas. I guess people will have read about the Auditor General report about the integrated transport plan, or the integrated transport plans, having several. So that discussion is out there at the moment. For us, it's really so developing an overall integrated transport plan, or also strategic regional transport plans. So for specific growth areas, that could be a basis for PSD development, and that would improve actually the connection of precinct structure plan areas to their surrounding areas and the transport network. Because at the moment, there is some planning for outside areas for bus transport routes, but overall the PSPs focus on their inner area. And if there would already be an overall strategic plan which the PSP can build on, that would actually make it easier to have the surrounding areas within view. And this would actually be connected to a staged public transport provision with definitions of triggers, which is our next Recommendation: introduce stage public and active transport provision, ensuring a basic level of provision at the commencement of settlement, and then stepping up as development milestones are met. And this idea, we kind of have got that from the city of Calgary in Canada, which has some differing levels of public transport provision. So they have an introductory level, basic level, frequent level, and I think they call it the principal level. And the idea is really to have the introductory transit for areas which had no public transport service before, like growth areas. Of course, there's still some requirements for population, but or other thresholds, but the idea is really to introduce public transport in new areas according to a minimum standard. And the stage provision refers to having different levels. So, for example, a trigger could be, well, if you have the first 100 dwellings within an area, there needs to be the introductory transit level. But then as population grows or more dwellings are there, then actually you need to move to the next level. So in Calgary speak, that will be basic level and so on. So that is the idea of this recommendation. And the first basic level, or not the basic level, the introductory level doesn't, of course, need to be the big buses going through some low populated suburbs, but they could be smaller buses, which they could be done as an on-demand service. I think Diana mentioned that before as well. They could be integrated with community transport, or even developers could be involved through providing shuttle buses as a work in kind. So that is the idea behind this one. Then the fifth recommendation, so start with a public transport network of direct and frequent routes in growth suburbs, complemented by routes that provide wider geographic coverage to ensure equitable access to transport. That really refers to attention for public transport. So public transport, in a way, you want to have a direct and frequent route so that people will use it because they know in 5 minutes I'll be at my station or something. But at the same time, you want to have a wide coverage so to reach as many people as possible, which is, for example, in that objective of having 95% of dwellings within 400 meters of a bus stop. And of course, you can't do both at the same time. So we think that for growth areas, actually starting with a few strategic direct bus lines that go directly to key destinations, such as train stations or activity centers, and connect the growth areas to other destinations within the city region is a sensible approach. But these direct routes need to be complemented by non-direct or coverage routes to ensure mobility for all households. Of course, you won't achieve mobility for all households right at the beginning, but so you need to have priorities, and we say start with a few strategic bus lines and try to complement it. And again, these meandering bus routes or the coverage bus routes could be on-demand services, community transport, etc. Then the sixth one, we've talked about that a lot, and yeah, I think Paul may mentioned it before as well, the early delivery of neighborhood or town centers to encourage active transport and provide a place for community activity. So that was actually interesting. So we started off with looking at transport, but this just came up all the time because active transport, you need somewhere to walk to. And we didn't find the magic bullet for this in research. We found some ideas within research, but also within real life, where you can do a little market, or as I said before, you can have the display center together with a community hub, like I think they did in Cylinderize. So that's really the idea behind this recommendation, to acknowledge the importance of that. And actually, I would love to do some more research into finding out how to achieve that. But as I said before, I think most of the stakeholders are actually really interested in coordinating or in having a neighborhood center, maybe not a town center, because you can't build the whole town center at the beginning, but in having a little hub at the beginning. So I think if this could be coordinated more, there would be some really great wins for growth areas. Then increase the average net density targets for growth suburbs in the PSP guidelines to at least 25 dwellings per hectare, per net developable hectare. And I've talked about that before. This is really from previous research, which says that, or which has found that to achieve walkability, densities of at least 25 dwellings per hectare are necessary. And those densities will also improve public transport viability. And I'm aware that the new guidelines, the new PSP guidelines actually mention 30 dwellings per hectare around town centres, but the average density of the precinct structure plan is still at 20. So that's, and we're talking about the average net density here. So we would suggest to increase that to at least 25 dwellings per net developable hectare. One other reason for that is actually also that we can't keep growing out, so we'll need to have some more densities, not only in the growth areas, but overall in Australian cities. So that's one of the backgrounds there. Ensure the timely implementation of local infrastructure that has been identified in contribution plans. I actually talked about that just before when I talked about the alternative funding options. So the idea is here really, you have identified infrastructure that is necessary in the local area, and some of this infrastructure is necessary for connectivity. So try to prioritize this infrastructure. And again, Paul has made a good point there before. So you have fragmented land ownership sometimes, and one of the developers might not build yet. So it's really a thing of how could you then actually achieve that that road is still built. So could someone else build it and get reimbursed later? So this is really what this recommendation is about. Then number 9, explore integrated transport pricing and a broad-based land tax as possible funding sources to improve delivery of active and public transport infrastructure and services. I've talked about that before, so I won't explain that in more detail. And similar with use the growth areas infrastructure contribution as an instrument to support the early delivery of transport options. And as I said before, we are aware that so there is the option to fund early delivery of transport options with 5 years of recurrent services, and our recommendation is really focus on these operations rather than on the infrastructure. And then the final one is this is something that came up quite a bit in the interview. So consider the costs of not providing transport infrastructure and services when undertaking cost-benefit analyses of transport infrastructure delivery options in growth areas. So business cases usually assess the outcome of what happens without a certain infrastructure and what happens with it. So in that sense, the cost of not providing infrastructure is already done. But the impression in the interviews was that some of the costs of not providing infrastructure are not considered, especially with regard to social outcomes. So some interview partners, for example, mentioned domestic violence. And I acknowledge that this is really difficult to draw the connections between that. But yeah, some of the social aspects could probably be acknowledged or put into those cost-benefit analysis a bit clearer. And we've tried to include that in, well, some social aspects in our cost-benefit analysis. So again, so we looked at the benefits of social and economic participation and also health aspects. And in that sense, we did it in a positive way. So we looked at the benefits, but of course, then if you look, well, what happens if you don't put that in? That's really, well, the costs of not providing a service. So you wouldn't have the opportunity for social participation for some people who don't have access to a car. So this is something that really needs to be put in more. And I know that there is discussion in that in transport research and probably practice as well. So the general recommendation here is really to broaden the horizon of benefits and consider which infrastructures are essential from a social cohesion point of view. And with that, we are through, and I'll hand over to Robin to lead Q&A. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Annette, and thanks to everybody who have stayed with us. The majority of people are still on the call. As you can see, it's been a tremendously large and complex project, but with many aspects, and we've tried to cover most of them today. So A few people have put questions in the meeting chat. A few people have also provided us with links to research and other things, and that's really terrific. I'll ask some of the questions, but while I do so, keep thinking of the things you might want to ask us about.
Robin, it seems you're mute. At least I can't hear you.
Can anybody else hear me?
Yes.
Lucy,
hear you,
you can hear. Oh,
Yep.
good.
I can hear you.
I don't think I'm on mute.
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Oh,
But now it says I have bad network quality, so maybe that's on my side.
all right.
Sorry.
Well, that's all right. Thank goodness you got to this point before it started playing up. That's all I can say. Yeah, so I was just encouraging people. I'll call out some of the questions, but I encourage you to think. We've got about 15 minutes left. We don't have to go the whole time, but of some of the things that we've talked about, the planning, sequencing, concentration of development, the behaviour change work that Steve presented, when's the window of opportunity. The work we went through very briefly on the lived experience, and we certainly have more data on that. The very complex work on the costs and benefits of the different, of putting in transport options early, and then Annette's presentation on the different sources of funding and what would appear to be the most promising, and then of course all of our recommendations. So there's a lot there that you might want to have a question about. I might start with what looks to me a fairly straightforward question from Shanti and bat it over to you, Lucy, which is, does the economic modelling undertaken consider the economic value to a household of not having to own a private vehicle?
The short answer is yes. Actually, I think Steve is the better person to answer this.
All right, sorry.
Well, between all of us, we found a way of looking at this, and it was looking at car ownership across the whole city to get a sense of where car ownership is highest and what it could be if you didn't need to own a car. So we kind of tried to siphon people off into different groupings so that we could model that reasonably accurate. But Steve actually is the person that would know more about it. So I'm going to handball to you, Steve.
Thanks. Yeah, that is, as Eric's just commented in a comment, yeah, when we added up the benefits, about 98% of them are attributable to not owning cars. So, yeah, we did consider it. I don't know whether I should go through in detail exactly how we did it, but the basically involved looking at what are levels of car ownership across Melbourne, what are the suburbs that are the lowest, the middle and the best, or perhaps the lowest ownership, the middle amount of ownership and the highest amount of ownership. And we undertook an assumption, which was to align our low, medium and high qualities of public transport with, it's the reverse, high, medium and low car ownership. So effectively, we're saying we're making an assumption that if we put in better transport, you could persuade people to start acting as they live in the areas of Melbourne where people currently have the lowest car ownership as opposed to the highest car ownership. Now that produced very high figures. So we also, and this is in the report, also had some sensitivity analysis that said, well, what if we halved or even quartered those figures? And it still came out that the benefits were way ahead of the costs, but for medium and high quality service. But that is still, it was still the case that the car ownership benefits were the highest part of the calculated benefits. Yes. And sorry, and the way we did it was we got some figures of, you know, what is the average amount expended on car ownership by a family, and we looked at what happened if households on average owned half a car less or a car less, and they all save several thousand per year. And you take a whole lot of households and let them save several thousand per year, it comes up to a lot. Of course, we also made an assumption that they'd have to start spending more money on public transport, but it's still a saving of some thousands per year.
Thanks, Steve. While you're on a roll, earlier in the meeting, Eric also had another question for you, which was about the longevity of the 10% uplift, that window of opportunity. Eric, I don't know if you want to voice any of that yourself, or what you've written is enough for Steve to go on.
It's certainly enough for me to go on, unless Eric would like to say something.
Giving him the opportunity.
Sorry. Yes.
Go ahead, Steve. I wrote a long question.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the short answer is we modelled it as a 30-year project life, and we simply applied the 10% over that 30 years. That's not because we only thought about year one and forgot about the rest. What we really think is that it might be a bit higher than 10 at the start and a bit lower than 10 at the end. If we'd come up with a lot of evidence that quantified it, you know, maybe we would have said, oh, it's 15% for the first few years, and then it's 10%, and then it's 5%, and we could have applied all that. But what we were doing was looking for, well, we didn't find evidence to support that kind of breakdown. It was hard enough coming up with a single figure. What we were looking for was a figure that we could adopt over our 30-year life, rather than, you know, making that fine-grained distinction between higher and lower figures. So I don't think we just, you know, took 10% and then failed to think about the future. That point about high house turnover is a really interesting one, isn't it? I suppose if people move out and new people move in, they're people who are coming in, hopefully, to somewhere where the public transport has already been provided. So they, in a sense, are ones who are at, you know, if you put in transport at the beginning and then over 7 years, say, people move out, those people who moved in at the start, well, they're motivated to change their habits and start using public transport, and then they drift off. And then, assuming you've put the transport in, you come up with a new set of people who are coming into an area that has public transport. So they're highly motivated again, and they'll start using public transport, and they may drift off again. The turnover kind of helps you. The last point I'd make, I suppose, is that it's a discounted cash flow analysis. So the calculations of costs and benefits in the early years are much more important than the later years. The fact that we assume 10% for the first few years contributes a lot more to the ultimate calculation than whatever we might have assumed for the last 10 years. So the answer to your question is it was also 10%.
Great, thanks. There are a fair bit of comment and questions around the town centre idea and the 20-minute neighbourhood questions, and I think in some sense there, Tim is asking, can we realistically move away from the model of needing a supermarket for a town centre to be built, and how do we support smaller local businesses? That's a big question. I'd love to do more work on the duopoly and the effect that it has. But certainly we have been talking about, and Annette might like to comment on this, about having, you know, small neighbourhood centres which mightn't involve a full-scale supermarket, something as a destination to at least get immediate necessity, so you don't have to necessarily get in your car when you just have run out of milk, that sort of thing. Andrew Bishop has put comments in which might also answer that. Annette, do you want to pick up on any of that theme?
Yes, sure. And I actually can't believe we went through this presentation without mentioning the 20-minute neighborhood, which is, of course, a really important point and something we kind of worked on. So, yeah, apologies for that. We should have acknowledged that that concept is actually out there in Plan Melbourne. And I think it's a really important point. And I think someone has suggested, so evaluating the plans for a PSP area against the objectives of the 20-minute neighborhoods, including transport. And I think that's actually a really good idea. It will be a challenge, I think, in growth areas to implement the 20-minute neighborhood, to achieve those kinds of services. It's already a challenge in middle suburbs, maybe less so in inner suburbs. But yeah, so it will be a challenge, but I think it's a really important thing. And that's really what we were talking about when we talked about local destinations, so that there are the most important points are there. So you can walk to something, you can walk to get your milk, but also maybe to go to the doctor. Although doctors are actually usually there quite early. but all these other things. So that is really important. And the thing with the smaller neighborhood centers, and that was really the idea which we used in the cost and benefits analysis again. So we put in for the early delivery or the low quality, sorry, a convenience store, and then later for the high quality, a town center. So because we thought, well, there are differences in the town center, as Lucy said, you can plan it on paper, but it's probably unlikely that it's there really from the beginning. And it probably doesn't even need to be there. It's really enough if you have a smaller neighborhood center, if you have a community hub, if you have, maybe a convenience store. That's sometimes already there in the growth areas, but often with the petrol stations. So that might be something different. Not sure if you want to walk to a petrol station, but at least there's something there. And that's what people also mentioned in the interviews. I wanted to make one other point, but I can't remember what it was. I'll come to it later.
It might be the dreaded density issue, which is that for retail to be viable, it needs a certain catchment, and that's leads us again back to the issue of developing things more quickly and quickly getting the local catchment area up to make things more viable for retailers.
Actually, I remembered what it was. I just wanted to mention that in the interviews in Cylinder Rise, residents were really pleased with the community center, which was there early. So that was one of the things that Stockland did there. So they had a community house early, and people thought that was really good and met people through there. So I think it's really, a good concept to do that.
Now, there's a comment on a different topic from Dwayne Burt, that we shouldn't be lumping walking and cycling together, and that shared pathways are not really best practice, and many pedestrians don't like getting bowled over by fast bicycles. Does anybody want to comment on that, how we dealt with that issue in our different scenarios?
We did actually put some in for in our cycling scenarios. We did actually put in some shared paths, but really the justification for that is in these areas, and it does come back to the dreaded density issue. Density is relatively low, and so you don't necessarily have as many pedestrians connecting or using the same infrastructure as cyclists. So that's one issue for justifying that kind of approach. But I do agree with Dwayne's commentary, and we have interviewed people who from local governments who said that the reason they put in shared paths is exactly as I mentioned. There isn't enough people, both pedestrians and cyclists, that are using that infrastructure, and so they don't consider it to be the same kind of problem in outer suburban areas as it would be in middle or inner suburbs where you do have more pedestrians connecting with cyclists. But I do agree with the statement that shared paths are, if we are able to separate them out, it is best practice to do so. I completely agree with that. I don't think you should be putting pedestrians next to cyclists if it can be avoided. I feel that Steve might have some commentary to add too there.
I'm just going to add that we did distinguish from a modelling perspective between our medium and high quality scenarios. So we didn't assume much by way of cycle infrastructure for low quality at all. When we came to medium quality, we assumed shared user paths. And then when we came to high quality, we assumed and costed providing some separated cycle paths to complement the shared paths. So the shared ones turn more into walkways. Specifically, we thought that along main roads, we might put, a shared path on one side, but a dedicated cycle track on the other. So that's part of the reason why our costs are higher for high quality service, because we threw those extra paths in. And then we also assumed that people would use active transport more if we provided that higher quality.
Yeah, but I think just coming off the back of that, it's also, I just think I kind of wanted to reiterate that, yes, there is a difference between shared cycle paths and separated cycle paths, but the growth areas themselves are a huge opportunity to get it right from the outset, because once you make these road space allocation decisions, it's very hard to rectify a problem. Like, it's very hard to put in a shared path if you haven't put in the space in the first instance. So although we took a very specific approach with our scenarios, in practice, there's other competing interests for road space, and that's something that is also political, so difficult to manage.
Okay, and there's been Shanti agreeing with Dwayne, and then Paul helpfully putting in some information from the BPA's perspective on that. We're almost out of time. The last quick question here from Nathan on transport assumptions. Did the modelling always assume the same volume or capacity of the road network?
Oh, I'm not sure it's an easy one to answer. It's not, well, in a sense, we didn't factor in some of that volume or capacity in a way, but at the same time, we allowed for it through, for example, with things like the bus network that goes for the most part on arterial roads. So it is a bit hard for us to answer that one.
Yeah, we haven't modelled car traffic. So I mean, one of the things we didn't cost, we've written about how it would be nice to cost it, but we didn't cost congestion. So we haven't gone into details of are the roads too full one way or another. So I mean, the short answer is yes. We assumed the same volume or capacity of the road network each time.
Yeah, and that was what I was going to jump in and say about that. We decided it was beyond our capacity to try and cost congestion, but especially in a radial transport system, increased car traffic all round does it doesn't have a linear relationship. More
it's more citywide, I think.
Yes,
I think what we were grappling with is that we wanted to contain the analysis to our case study areas, but there's flow-on effects from if you've got people who are using active transport and not driving, there's a flow-on effect to other areas of the city as well. And we just couldn't conceptualise how to do that without doing a very, very large full-scale analysis of the city with transport demand models. And we just decided to shy away from that and leave that as something that was out of scope. It was just beyond what we could manage.
Now, I think I'm going to have to call an end to it. I'll just note that Matthew Keane has reiterated he'd like to see an evaluation of the PSPs against the 20-minute neighbourhood objectives before gazetting. I think that's a very interesting call. But as it's 3:56 and we said we'd definitely finish by 4 o'clock, I think we'll have to stop the discussion. You could probably keep going in the meeting chat after we finish. But we'd just like, I think at this point, again, to thank everybody. You can see what terrific project and process it's been, particularly, again, all those partner representatives. But also, I'd like to reiterate that we have, and perhaps Annette can help me here, the final report is now on the website. I think we've got working papers which are not there, but you can request them from us. The working papers go into a lot more detail on a particular topic. I think we've got 4, have we, Annette, or how many working papers? And then we've got some much briefer summaries, both of our recommendations and also of different policy areas. Annette, I'll just let you comment on those outputs and their availability if you can.
Yeah, you were completely right. So the policy briefs are on the website, and I put a link to the website in the chat, and the final report is there as well, and the working papers. And I think we actually have 6, 7 of them.
Time
so
flies.
you see, it's a big project. If you're interested in any of those, just send me an email and I can send them to you. So that's.
Do we list on the website what the topics of the working papers are? Yes. Yeah. Good. All right. Well, look, thanks very much to all of you for attending, and for so many people for staying with us for the 2 hours. It's terrific. And thanks once again to the wonderful research team, particularly again to Annette, who has just held this whole thing together. As we all know, it's been a pretty challenging time the last 18 months for everybody, and staying sane and focused and on time and on budget, as they say, is a wonderful thing. So thanks to all of our team, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Yep.
And
thank
goodbye.
Bye.
See you all. Bye, Helen.